We are back in Brussels for our second season, and we're kicking the series off with the hottest debate in Europe. Do we need more budget flexibility? Italy and France have both announced budgets that push for flexibility to pull their economies out of the doldrums. But remember, those budgets are now under the close scrutiny of the European Commission. So, on the show, we speak to Thomas Wieser, president of the Eurogroup, about whether this push for flexibility by some countries is a valid one, or are they looking for leniency and fiscal discipline during difficult times? And what about the argument by some that flexibility is needed for investment for growth? So here's the debate. Some large countries believe Europe is seeing weakened demand and annual budget cuts are just making things worse. You see this with France's debt and deficit projections, and Italy paints a very difficult picture as well. Other large countries with more balanced budgets or a surplus think that relaxing budgetary discipline to juice the economy just reduces pressure on governments to reform. So Gianni Maggi analyzes the debate and looks at international examples of kickstarting economies to see if they hold any clues for Europe.
In Europe, the rules must relate to stability and growth. Without stability, there is no growth. Without growth, there is no stability. First, growth and employment by using all margins, all flexibilities of the so-called Stability and Growth Pact.
Italy and France want the EU to bend the rules, but others, like Germany, insist on respecting budget rules.
During the crisis, some countries on the brink of default have needed bailouts under the supervision of the Troika. But all EU member states are required to comply with strict rules to prevent governments spending too much more than their income. All this with the goal that, in the good times, countries can carefully prepare for the bad.
The European Union has adopted the Stability and Growth Pact aimed to ensure fiscal discipline. Like a sports team, every state has to comply with the same rules, adopting a budget with a maximum deficit of 3% of GDP. In addition, each state's total debt must not exceed 60% of GDP. If these limits are not respected, the authorities launch warnings that can lead to the opening of an excessive deficit procedure, and if this is not enough, to real sanctions. The agreement was amended over time, first loosening the rules and introducing new parameters to take into account the particular conditions of each member state. More recently, the rules were again reinforced and in some cases made automatic with the adoption of the fiscal compact, under which the balanced budget rule became a fundamental law of each state that approved it.
What did the other major economic powers do in the meantime? The United States responded to the crisis with a strong stimulus plan for the economy, which has led to an increase in the deficit and public debt. And Japan launched a policy that is even controversial in Europe.
The US is now in a solid recovery, which has allowed the US to actually consolidate its budget, actually as quickly as the Eurozone. But in the Eurozone, the recession was getting worse. So in the Eurozone, fiscal policy aggravated the economic situation.
The so-called Abenomics policy adopted in 2012 by Japanese PM Shinzo Abe rests on fiscal stimulus, monetary easing and structural reforms. The country runs on a huge deficit and has the largest public debt in the world as a percentage of GDP. The first consequences of Abenomics were generally positive.
This policy has been successful in the sense that expectations about inflation have changed. So inflation expectations have gone up and also inflation is picking up.
But in the longer term, Abenomics seems to be losing steam, mainly due to a national sales tax hike. Could this policy be a model for Europe?
Translating something like Abenomics to the Eurozone would be extremely controversial, as it would have to involve the purchase of large quantities of government bonds.
To pick up on Gianni's points, joining us now is Thomas Wieser. He is the man who, at the EU level, governments have to come to for aid. Mr. Wieser, thank you very much for giving us your time. You've seen other countries around the world do what they have to pull their economies out of the doldrums. What do you make of the debate about flexibility being required in Europe right now?
Fiscal policy coordination is a bit like in a family where both partners have an income of their own, but nevertheless they need to discuss with each other, how am I going to spend it? And you want to make sure that your partner is not too profligate, because otherwise that would destabilize the whole household. Therefore, you need to be flexible. You need to be able to adapt to lower growth, to higher growth one day, to lower inflation and other changes.
Member states have to follow very strict criteria. How much room is there really to maneuver within that?
We take account of lower inflation, we take account of lower growth, and then the actual outcome or the actual policy plan can be different. If your growth is 1% lower, then your deficit can be somewhat higher. A very large part of what we do relies on peer group pressure, where we do hope that large countries behave as well as the small countries do. There are, of course, nasty incentives. You could actually be fined. The fine can go as far as 0.2% of GDP.
Do you think we possibly are dealing with a situation where we might just have to let it go?
No, I'm quite sure that the Italian government and the French government will engage with the Commission and then later engage with the Eurogroup, and they will undertake the necessary reforms. If you engage in those structural reforms that make your economy more robust, make it grow more strongly in the future, then you can have 1 or 2 more years in order to bring your budget into a balanced position.
We'll catch up with Thomas Wieser in just a bit, but first take a look at Italy's growth picture. It's in its 3rd year of recession with only marginal growth expected next year. The Italian Prime Minister wants to tackle reforms to drive investments for growth, but how does he plan to pay for it? By borrowing or increasing Italy's debt load. Now, the plan is controversial to an extent, so are businesses and investors concerned by it, or do they think it's necessary to drive growth? Gianni Maggi finds out.
Behind the postcard image of Italy is the reality that tourism accounts for about 10% of GDP. And the economy is still going quite well, mainly due to the money spent by foreign visitors. In recent years, Italians have had to tighten their belts, especially following reforms adopted to put public finances in better shape.
The deficit GDP ratio might make people think that Italy's done its homework well, but this has been achieved at the cost of an economy without growth and fewer jobs.
This part of Venice is called Marghera. Just a few steps from the Grand Canal, it is a former industrial area that is becoming a symbol of abandonment and loss of valuable jobs.
We once produced 47% of Italian chemical output, but today we produce almost nothing. We need productive investments, we need industrial policy choices. We are harnessed by the Stability Pact. I've never heard of a Europe that starts from the law. The amount of black economy, the amount of money that escapes taxation throughout Europe is enormous. It would probably be appropriate to start there.
So, investments. It doesn't matter if they come from the public or the private sector. The revival of the economy and employment is most people's priority. But how to make this compatible with good economic discipline? Lotto Sport is a sportswear company based in Venice, operating with production sites around the world.
I believe there are resources that are yet to be properly trimmed, expenditures that are probably not appropriate to the level of the situation. But we have also opportunities of investment that should be properly exploited.
So resources can still be found to finance investments. But what levers should governments employ to stimulate the economy?
A deficit spending, but invested in good infrastructure, productive projects, where there's an intelligent, wise governance of costs compared to the productivity of investment. Here we go again on a positive Keynesian lever, where actually those amounts are not wasted but are properly invested.
Still with us is Thomas Wieser. Flexibility for investment toward growth is necessary. Why is there so much of hesitance at the EU level?
What really matters about growth is private investment, and this has been held back by numerous factors: fragmentation of financial markets, lack of reform of labor markets, and in general low profitability of the corporate enterprise sector. The answer that I think is the correct one is you have to cut down on current consumption, on current expenditure, in order to create headroom, financial headroom, so that you can finance investment not only this year. You want to finance more investment from 2015 onward for the next decade and decades. You can invest more within the current rules.
Many would say this is going round and round in circles.
What we need to do is to bring the indebtedness of the economies as a whole under control. In most countries, some sectors of the economy need to deleverage, be it the banking sector, be it the government sector, be it the private sector. And that's why you need to change the composition of your spending, higher rates of growth because of private investment and because of government investment. Would you want your spouse to invest in equities for the future to enable a future stream of income, or would you want your spouse to spend it in one fell swoop? You would want your government to invest in your children's future and not necessarily by just splurging it on some prestige objects.
Do you think we're going to stay within the rules and not change it?
The rules will not be changed. The rules offer a quite fair degree of flexibility. We will stay within the rules, and they will be positive for growth all over Europe, and especially, I believe, in Italy, which we have just been discussing.
That's a wrap on this episode of Real Economy, with the debate on budget flexibility set to continue for a while. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.